that was just over the top in terms of high quality, very valuable discussion. Can't thank the panelists enough. But nothing for me to say other than thanks to our panelists. And, maybe Thomas, you've been watching the audience and the chat. Any any quick takes from that?
Well, there's an active chat, but I think what we could try to do for a couple minutes is maybe go over some of the lightning round questions, because I think those are things that people are curious about. And pediatric vouchers was one of them. I guess one question for the pundits on our panel is, when will it pass? I think people are waiting for that. Is it going to be this spring? Is Congress all tied up with other things? More powers, impeachments, I have no idea, ICE, or do we have to wait until September 2027 to see pediatric vouchers and other things with the PDUFA package?
Are we with the audience still, Thomas?
Yes, this is the informal part, and we have a lot of people who are just hanging around waiting on your words.
Okay.
Well, there are 80 or 90 people still on, so let's give them something to listen to.
We covered pediatric vouchers pretty well.
Yes.
We might just say it's likely to happen. We'll be seeing it.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the panel's thoughts about the so-called national priority voucher program and its sort of rough start, in my opinion. They've got a couple of selectees that have not proven to be ready to go. But maybe, what are your thoughts, Frank, about this national priority voucher program?
It's kind of, I'll go back to what I referenced earlier, in that Peter Stein was the first person who publicly announced, that the FDA was going to be implementing the 1997 law with the new guidance, where they're going to recognize confirmatory evidence as kind of the second, as a way to confirm the findings of a single positive, adequate, and well-controlled study. So, but that information from talking to Peter, all of that work, there was maybe a 10-year process internally to get to the point where Peter was able to stand up at the Willard Hotel in September 2019 and show his slides, which I still have kept copies of because they were so, kind of trailblazing. But what I'm getting at is that shows a process that works bottom up, that both Peter and Steve talked about being a bottom up process. And where we have this top down process that isn't taking into account, wisdom that's inherent in the institution, it's a different process. We used to call things like Peter talking as podium policy, but we knew it was podium policy because it was being spoken from podium, but it had everyone input inside the agency behind it. Today, we might call, instead of podium policy, we might call it podcast policy, because it's like when people are going to come on to a podcast and say, I've got an idea. And then it hasn't been internally worked. To give you an example, when I referred to the plausible mechanism pathway, which came out in November, I was at the National Press Club at a meeting, and I won't say who, was an office director in the Center for Drugs. I went up to the office director and I said, by the way, can you tell me something a little bit more than, and the office director said, Frank, you know as much as we do because you've read the same New England Journal article as we've read. So it's just, it's both Peter and Stephen have spoken to this. So, and they've spoken much more eloquently to this than I have. So, but I just want to say it's emblematic of how things have changed. And I'm just saying they changed because I did applaud the concept of the plausible mechanism pathway. I want to help, Dr. McCary and Dr. Hogue and Dr. Prasad and Dr. Tanhai and Kumar. I want to help flesh that out. I want it so that it can help patients. But it's not being delivered to the public as a fully formed concept. And I think that's the same thing with the commissioner's national priority voucher program.
Yeah. Well, and another podium policy is and we'll ask Peter to comment on this, the so-called one trial makes all will be sufficient for approval. Peter, is that really a thing? Can you really, is that going to make a difference in chronic drug therapy approvals?
And Peter, just state the policy we're talking about for the audience, please.
I'm not sure there really is an enunciated policy, but I think the idea was whether the typical approach that has been instantiated for many years based upon appropriate reading of the statute, which talks about the need for investigations, that it's been interpreted to, and I think the prior congressional discussions on this made it very clear that the intent was to require 2 or more adequate and well-controlled trials to meet substantial evidence. But as you know, in 1997, that was changed to 1 in confirmatory evidence. And Frank, as much as I'd like to suggest that I somehow instantiated policy, the truth of the matter is confirmatory evidence has been used since the statutory change. It's just that guidance was developed by some terrific people in the policy office at OND, Jen Pippins and others, who put together with broad OND and Cedar-wide input a guidance that articulates and clarifies, and I think perhaps better characterizes what would be acceptable types of confirmatory evidence. But confirmatory evidence has been used for many, many years before that guidance came out, before I said anything at any podium. In terms of the one trial, I mean, you should realize that already, if you look at the substantial evidence guidance, one trial is already in there. The issue, if you think about it, a lot of the background for the 2 or more trials came from the recognition that back in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, many of the trials that were submitted to the FDA were little teeny trials. They were trials with, one or 2 sites ran a trial and with 20 patients, not necessarily with the best designed or conducted trial. And so one of those trials didn't mean very much, and the statute really evolved based upon that understanding of how drugs were being developed back then. Now, of course, fast forward now to the last 2 decades, where drug trials are generally global, or sometimes they're U.S. only, but often they're global, multinational trials and very large trials and much better powered. The guidance that came out just a couple of years ago on substantial evidence articulated the 3 pathways that were already understood and used. One is 2 or more well-controlled trials. Another is 1 trial and confirmatory evidence based upon the change in the law in 1997. And the third is one trial that provides the same evidentiary the evidentiary threshold as would occur with 2 or more trials. And so what does that mean? It means that a trial that is consistent in its primary and secondary endpoints across its different sites, across subtypes, and typically is a trial which is focused on a significant morbidity or on mortality. But that is in statute, and it has been used. There are approvals already with 1 trial that is a very, very rigorously done trial with very convincing p-value and consistent findings throughout all of the primary and secondary endpoints. And so it's not necessarily a change. I think we have to recognize that we can say, well, let's move to 1 trial, but we should also just recognize, what do you give up when you do that? Well, 1 trial with a p-value of less than 0.05, I'm not going to go into. I think most people know what a p-value means, but it certainly doesn't necessarily mean that the drug works. When you have 2 trials, both of which show the same outcome, then you have a much greater surety. And I think the question really comes down to, and this is what the commissioners have to consider as he's pushing this kind of these kind of changes. Are we okay with more mistakes? I'd say more drugs that actually don't work, but have 1 trial that suggests that they do work. I mean, I think that's an important consideration that we have to think about is what do we give up when we do that? And again, I would go back to the point that one trial is already used. The one trial approach has already been used for a number of approvals, but that trial has to meet the criteria that are articulated nicely in the substantial evidence guidance.
Peter, maybe you could uh, respond to a position I've taken that I'm not sure I'm right on, but so I'm sure I've overstated in writing, which is that there is that the current state is two are required, except when you can show that there's justification for something that is either confirmatory instead of the second, or in some other. In other words, I like the standards you've set up. That if you have two trials with lots and lots and lots of exceptions where one trial, however formulated, is sufficient, that it's hugely different than a standard that says one is required and we'll tell you when we need a second one.
Yeah,
And
I think
I think that the message change is just awful.
I would agree because then what it is one trial with a P of 0.049 is sufficient. And one trial with a P of 0.0001, that's a large trial with consistent endpoints and consistent findings across sites for a very serious disease where needing and doing another trial is very challenging. That may be sufficient, and that's what the guidance currently allows. But I completely agree with you. If the standard is lowered to one trial, well, there'll be approvals of drugs with a P of 0.046, and those drugs probably work. And, again, the statistics would say they work, but they certainly don't give anyone the assurance that the current standards do. And just to pick up on something else that you've mentioned, which is something that I think is really an important sort of philosophical point in the confirmatory guidance, is that the confirmatory evidence is not a sort of single thing. It can be a range of different aspects and evidence, all of which has to be meaningful and scientifically valid. But you can put together confirmatory evidence with multiple components. But moreover, the strength of confirmatory evidence isn't the same in all applications. If you have one really strong trial, adequate, well-controlled trial with a strong p-value, the burden on confirmatory evidence is lower. And on the other hand, if you have a trial that has a more marginal p-value 0.04, not the most rigor, not the most robust evidence, then the strength of confirmatory evidence has to be much greater. And so, really the one trial approach has been instantiated more often by using confirmatory evidence to increase the probability that the one trial gave the right answer. And I think is the approach that is much wiser and much better than just saying, hey, one trial, because what you're left with is no other evidence that really could be mounted to support the probability that the drug works. And then you're left with one trial that that gives you some confidence, but not a very high level of confidence. If you ask me what I would want to give to my children or my wife or my family, would I give a drug that was proven with one trial with a P of 0.04? My answer would be no. I would give a drug that has two trials that have established that the drug works, has properly characterized safety, and that's a drug that I think we can trust. And I think we all know that even the phase 3 programs that are currently done don't characterize drugs fully, and there's much we learn after drugs are approved, both about their efficacy and about their safety. And I can only imagine a situation where one trial is sufficient and you're ending up with learning much more afterwards, and on some of the things I suspect would be learnings you wouldn't want to have afterwards. So I'm not in favor of changing things because I think the public deserves to be sure that a drug works and is safe, and I think the change would change that formula to being not so much sure, but better than even odds, which is not good enough from my perspective.
Such an
Just
important
calling.
point. And to emphasize that it's relatively easy in many cases to show efficacy, but to be able to assess safety typically takes more than would be the case for just demonstrating a therapeutic effect that's desired.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And which is why the implications of it are limited, because in general, what drives this, the need for two trials, are certainly the size of the overall program, is the need for
Yeah.
adequate safety exposure and characterization that supports labeling. So I think you're quite right.
Just calling the
So
panel's
we
attention.
don't have anything resembling, an articulation of the new policy. So it's hard to opine. But what I understood where we might be headed directionally is not one trial full stop, but one trial plus confirmatory evidence, but opened up to a broader range of products than the serious or life-threatening disease category.
Oh, can I correct you there? There's
Yep.
nothing in the statute that refers to the need for confirmatory evidence to be in serious, life-threatening unmet needs. It doesn't say
Yeah,
that.
no, I understand. I'm saying that the way FDA, from a policy perspective, through guidance, has interpreted the statute is they have tended to limit the use of one study plus confirmatory evidence to particular cases, serious and life-threatening. And what I understood that the commissioner may be headed directionally was to open up one study plus confirmatory evidence to as a more general approach than the more limited approach it has been historically. And I think one of the interesting things to think about, I mean, I totally agree with you that, at the heart of this is how much uncertainty is the public willing to bear. That's critical. But it's interesting to think about, the issue with one study is, was that the result of chance? And the question is, do we have more analytical tools available to us and more visibility into the disease pathway to get a higher sense of confidence that what we saw in that experiment, the passing study, and I don't want to talk about marginally passing studies, but a clearly passing study, single study, can we get to a higher level of comfort that that was not a false positive through using other tools, other sources of evidence, rather than repeating the study, doing it a second time. I mean, doing the study twice, yes, that was an old way of reaching, a higher level of statistical confidence. But I think it might, if you push the policy in that direction, it could actually have a very favorable effect on innovation in science, because there'll be incentives to develop new tools to gain confidence that what we saw empirically in the one experiment, we can say with confidence was not the result of chance.
Yeah, I mean, just two quick comments on that. I just want to make one is that you're absolutely right that confirmatory evidence can be very compelling, and because there can be multiple sources of it, I think it can complement a single trial that's itself reasonably convincing, to provide a package that certainly would meet substantial evidence. I think the thing that's, we should recognize that in common diseases, and I think this was already made, Zan, I think, comment on this, that typically you still are going to need more than one trial anyway, just to get the
Absolutely, for safety.
exposure.
Yeah, safety is a
But
whole different issue. Yes.
But I do think, and so really where it applies is where it's been applied, which is in rarer diseases where doing two trials is more challenging. I think because the statute already allows for this. Again, the statute doesn't say in serious diseases. It basically says it's, at FDA's discretion, essentially, or secretary's discretion or whatever.
Right.
But it doesn't say, that there are particular criteria where it can or cannot be otherwise applied. It's more of where appropriate. And I think this doesn't therefore require statutory change. And I think, a
Right.
company could itself just say, look, we have enough patients in this one trial, and we have preclinical evidence, we have real world evidence. As to John Jenkins' point, we have mechanistic data and PD pharmacodynamic data to give you a compelling case that the results from the trial that we're going to conduct are indeed showing that the drug is effective, and would you, FDA, accept it? I think a company that pressed on that point could potentially be successful, because there's nothing in the statute that would undermine their argument, other than the fact that it is discretion as to where this is used. But I think, truthfully, to your point, a very strong scientific basis where you understand how the drug works, the molecular target in the pathogenesis of disease, and you have evidence from preclinical and clinical data that all told gives you a compelling case the drug works, and then you have a positive trial, I think that gives you the same level of evidence essentially as two positive trials. So I completely agree with you. And I think that's on the table. And I think companies could push on that point where they felt that it was would make their program more streamlined.
Boy, we could keep going for hours and hours. And I do apologize to Jody and Ricardo for getting into the weeds of drug and biologic development. But boy, what terrific additions they were to this panel. And likewise, everybody else was just stellar. It could not have been more valuable. The only problem is, as usual, we left a lot of stuff on the table, and we'll have to come back to those offline. But again,
Or
can't thank
maybe
you
do a
enough.
mid-year edition instead of just doing it
Yeah,
annually
I think
or
we probably
quarterly.
we need, yeah, there's just too much to cover in a single annual version. So thanks
Well,
for that
whoa
suggestion.
or yo.
Well, let's stick
All
with
right,
holy
well, we better
cow.
bring it to a close. I know everybody's got to get on other calls, and so thanks again. It was just wonderful. I learned more than anybody.
Thanks,
Great.
everyone.
Take care all.
Thank you,
Thank
Zan.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.